In a Japanese women POW camp in the United States during World War II, one rule was quietly broken every single night. Not with violence, not with rebellion, but with light. The bathroom lights stayed on long after curfew. The hot water kept running when it wasn't supposed to. Why would American guards, the victors of the war, allow this? What were they choosing not to see? And why did silence become the most powerful form of mercy? This is a story history almost never tells, a hidden chapter of the Japanese Women POW experience, where respect was shown not through words, but through restraint. If you think victory is only about power, stay until the end. Subscribe to the channel, because this story may change how you define humanity in war. They arrived without chains. That, more than anything else, felt wrong to the women stepping down from the transport trucks. No shouting. No rifle butts. No dogs. Just paperwork, clipped instructions, and men in unfamiliar uniforms who didn't raise their voices. For many of the Japanese women POW, this silence was unsettling. They had been taught, over and over, that American soldiers were cruel, primitive, incapable of restraint. That surrender meant humiliation. That captivity meant abuse. Yet the camp did not look like the nightmare they had been warned about. Barbed wire, yes. Watchtowers, yes. But also order. Clean barracks. Measured distance. A strange, uncomfortable calm. When fear doesn't arrive on time, what takes its place? One woman, our story follows her, though her name could have been anyone's, noticed this immediately. In her late 20s, she had worked in logistics before the war. She understood systems. And systems, she knew, always revealed their values through small details. The camp ran on rules. Lights out at a fixed hour. Head counts twice a day. Restricted movement. Strict boundaries. Power was absolute, but carefully contained. That first night, exhaustion took most of them quickly. The barracks lights snapped off precisely on schedule, plunging the room into darkness. No exceptions. No softness. But later, much later, someone whispered. The bathroom lights were still on. At first it seemed like a mistake. New camp. Human error. Someone would notice. But the minutes passed. Then an hour. Hot water continued to run. Steam slipped from beneath the door, curling into the cold night air. No guard shouted. No one knocked. No corrections were made. The women noticed. Every one of them. No one spoke. Why would a prison allow the one place of privacy to remain open after curfew? The second night it happened again. And the third. By the fourth, silence had turned into understanding. This was not negligence. It was a decision. Guards patrolled nearby, but never too close. Their footsteps slowed. Their eyes averted. When a young soldier approached the doorway once, an older guard quietly placed a hand on his arm and shook his head. Nothing was said. Everything was communicated. From the outside, the rulebook remained intact. On paper, nothing was wrong. Yet somehow, within that rigid system, space had been carved out, not officially, not publicly, but deliberately. Is respect still respect if it exists only in what is not enforced? For the women, this moment was deeply confusing. They were prisoners. They had lost a war. They had no power. And yet, here was a boundary the captors refused to cross. The bathroom became something more than a facility. It was not indulgence. It was not comfort. It was permission not to be watched. In a war defined by control over bodies, that choice mattered more than food rations or blankets. What does it say about a victor who chooses restraint over dominance, when no one would have stopped them from doing otherwise? At this stage, the women still did not trust the camp. Nor should they have. Barbed wire does not disappear because kindness exists alongside it. But something had shifted. The enemy they had been taught to fear was not the enemy standing before them. And that realization, quiet, unsettling, and undeniable, was the first crack in everything they thought they understood about war. By the time these women entered American custody, the war, at least on paper, was already ending. The United States was bound by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which outlined how prisoners of war were to be treated. While Japan had not fully ratified the convention, the U.S. military chose to follow it regardless, particularly after surrender. Under American policy, POWs were not classified as criminals. They were considered wards of the state, protected by rules designed to prevent abuse, humiliation, and exploitation. This applied even more strictly to women. Japanese women POWs were rare and most were not combatants. Many had served as nurses, clerks, factory workers, or civilian auxiliaries. As a result, U.S. camps often treated them separately from male prisoners, emphasizing medical care, supervision, and, above all, discipline among guards. Sexual misconduct by American personnel was not ignored. It was explicitly prohibited and severely punished. The goal was not mercy born from emotion, but restraint enforced through structure. Still, not everything that mattered was written into regulations. Some decisions, like when to turn off a light, were left to human judgment. And it was there, in the space between policy and practice, that this story truly begins. Routine is a powerful thing. It can numb fear. It can soften grief. And in captivity, it can quietly reshape how people understand their captors. For the Japanese women POW, life inside the camp quickly fell into predictable patterns. Wake-up calls came at the same hour every morning. Meals were basic but sufficient. Work assignments rotated weekly: laundry, kitchen support, inventory, translation for those who spoke English. Nothing about the routine felt kind. But nothing felt chaotic either. And that, in itself, mattered. Is cruelty always loud, or is it sometimes hidden in unpredictability? The women began to realize that the American guards valued order more than intimidation. Rules were enforced evenly. Punishments, when they came, were procedural rather than emotional. No shouting matches. No personal insults. No arbitrary cruelty. This wasn't mercy. It was discipline. For many of the women, this was deeply disorienting. They had been taught that their captors would be impulsive, violent, easily provoked. Instead, what they encountered was a system that functioned almost mechanically. And yet, within that rigidity, there were edges that softened at night. The bathroom lights remained the most obvious example. No one acknowledged it openly. But over time, it became part of the camp's unspoken rhythm. After evening head count, the barracks lights went dark. Guards made their rounds. Silence settled. Then quietly the bathroom became a place apart. Steam would gather near the ceiling. The sound of running water carried softly across the yard. Footsteps slowed as guards passed nearby, not stopping, not investigating, just passing. What does it mean when power chooses not to look? For the women, the bathroom was not a place of comfort. It was cold, institutional, poorly insulated. But it offered something far rarer: temporary invisibility. They did not speak to one another about why the lights stayed on. Cultural shame made even thinking about the subject difficult. But shared experience does not require shared language. They understood. War had taken almost everything from them: home, certainty, identity. But their bodies remained, governed by the same biology as before. Hunger. Exhaustion. Cycles that did not stop simply because a uniform changed on the other side of a fence. Ignoring those realities would not erase them. Does civilization begin when we acknowledge human needs, or when we pretend they don't exist? From the guard's perspective, the situation was equally tense, though in a different way. Most of the men assigned to the camp were no longer fresh recruits. Many had seen combat in the Pacific. They carried memories they did not discuss: jungles, beaches, comrades who hadn't made it back. They were trained to maintain distance, to follow procedure, and most importantly, to never abuse their authority. Sexual contact with prisoners was strictly forbidden. Not discouraged, not frowned upon. Forbidden. Violations led to courts-martial, prison sentences, dishonorable discharge. This wasn't left to personal morality. It was policy. Still, policy could not account for every human detail. One guard, fictional but representative, understood this better than most. He had joined the army at 19. Now in his mid-20s, the war felt older than he was. He had learned the cost of what happened when power operated without restraint. When he noticed the delayed shutdowns of the bathroom lights during his first week at the camp, he said nothing. So did everyone else. The omission wasn't discussed in meetings. It wasn't written in logs. It existed only as a shared understanding, passed on through glances, gestures, and what older guards did not correct. When a new transfer once reached for the switch, the warning came quietly: leave it. No explanation followed. Is morality something you announce, or something you pass on in silence? This silence formed an unspoken contract. The women did not abuse the privilege. They did not linger unnecessarily. They did not treat the space as a rebellion. The guards did not ask questions. They did not monitor. They did not make remarks. Both sides understood how fragile the arrangement was. Too much attention would destroy it. And so, everyone behaved as though nothing unusual was happening. Yet everything was. Historically, this moment existed within a larger shift in American military thinking. After Japan's surrender, U.S. leadership understood that the way prisoners were treated would define post-war authority. Brutality would not erase Japanese militarism, it would justify it. Respect, however controlled and imperfect, served a different purpose. It demonstrated who held moral ground after victory. Can restraint be a strategy? Within that framework, the decisions made by ordinary guards took on larger meaning. They weren't heroes. They weren't activists. They weren't trying to make history. They were simply choosing not to exploit a situation where exploitation was possible. For the women, this choice planted the earliest seeds of something dangerous and unfamiliar: trust. Not trust in freedom. Not trust in justice. But trust that there were lines even victors would not cross. That realization did not erase the trauma of captivity, but it altered how the trauma was understood. The camp became a place of loss, but not degradation. And that distinction would matter long after the barbed wire disappeared from view. If dignity survives captivity, what does that say about the people who allowed it to survive? Over time, the camp stopped feeling temporary. Days no longer blurred into emergencies. Instead, they formed a rhythm, slow, repetitive, almost domestic in its predictability. For the Japanese Women POW, this was perhaps the most unsettling change of all. Wars were supposed to be loud. This one, at least here, was quiet. The women adapted as humans always do. They learned which guards were strict, which were indifferent, and which ones seemed determined never to look directly at them. Small habits formed. Shoes placed the same way each night. Hair braided more tightly. Letters rewritten endlessly even when there was nowhere to send them. The body, however, did not adapt so easily. Stress, trauma, and irregular nutrition altered physical cycles. Some women lost weight rapidly. Others slept too much or not at all. Medical checks were routine and clinical, handled by female staff whenever possible. Yet there were limits to what regulation could manage. Desire did not vanish with defeat. Need did not disappear behind fences. And this reality, never discussed, never acknowledged, hovered over the camp like humidity. Is it immoral to recognize a human need, or immoral to deny that it exists? The bathroom increasingly became the axis around which this tension revolved. It was the only place where guards did not linger. The only structure without windows. The only space not designed for observation. And that was intentional. The guards knew what extended privacy meant. They were not naive. Many had lived for years in all-male units where the consequences of ignoring human impulses became violently clear. They also understood something else: what happens when power meets vulnerability without boundaries. Abuse doesn't begin with cruelty. It begins with permission. And so the lights remained on. Not forever. Not officially. But long enough. For the women, this quiet concession carried enormous psychological weight. It did not feel like generosity, it felt like acknowledgement. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, recognized that stripping a person of dignity accomplishes nothing except corrosion. What breaks first in captivity, the body or the belief that you still deserve privacy? Not all guards were comfortable with this arrangement. A younger soldier once questioned it during a shift change. He had joined after the surrender, too late to see real combat, eager to assert authority where he could. "Why are we letting that run?" he asked, gesturing vaguely. The response was immediate but restrained. "Because we're done with the war," came the reply. That ended the conversation. The phrase lingered longer than expected. Because for some men the war was indeed over. For others, it lived on internally, seeking outlets, justification, release. The camp's leadership understood this danger. They knew that unchecked resentment posed a greater risk than any prisoner. Discipline protected everyone. Historically, this concern was not unfounded. Allied command knew that misconduct in POW camps could undermine America's post-war position, particularly in Asia, where the U.S. sought influence, reconstruction partnerships, and legitimacy. How prisoners were treated would become part of how victory itself was judged. Can a nation win a war and still lose its moral authority afterward? This awareness trickled down imperfectly, but it did trickle. Guards were reminded constantly: professionalism mattered. Self-control mattered. What you did when no one was watching mattered most. Inside the barracks, conversations among the women shifted subtly. They stopped talking only about home. They started talking, carefully, about the future. Some wondered whether the Americans truly saw them as enemies anymore. Others feared that kindness was merely a prelude to manipulation. After years of propaganda, mistrust had become instinct. But even suspicion could not erase observation. The guards did not leer. They did not comment. They did not exploit moments of vulnerability. Absence, repeated consistently, became evidence. How many times does restraint need to be proven before it becomes believable? One woman, older than most, articulated it best during a late-night conversation. Speaking quietly as though words themselves might attract punishment, she said, "They don't touch us because they don't need to." That sentence lingered. Power, she implied, was not being resisted. It was being restrained voluntarily. And that distinction mattered. The women still woke behind fences. Still ate rations. Still followed orders. Freedom remained out of reach. But humiliation did not define their captivity. That, in the context of war, was radical. The bathroom lights continued to glow against the dark yard, soft, unremarkable, easy to miss. No record would ever note this deviation. No report would commemorate it. Yet for everyone involved, it was an ethical line drawn quietly and defended daily. Would you notice the line if it wasn't announced? In retrospect, it was these small, uncelebrated choices that did the most work. They prevented abuse without spectacle. They preserved humanity without gratitude. They required vigilance without praise. And they asked something difficult of everyone involved. To see prisoners not as symbols of an enemy ideology, but as bodies that still felt, still needed, still deserved limits to suffering. The war had stripped away illusions of honor and glory. What remained was choice. And every night, as the lights stayed on just a little longer, that choice was reaffirmed. As weeks turned into months, the camp began to change, not in structure but in meaning. Nothing about the fences shifted. No locks were removed. No promises were made. Yet something else settled in quietly, like dust after a storm. Normalization. For the Japanese women POW, captivity stopped being a constant state of alertness. Fear receded into the background, replaced by vigilance, quieter, more sustainable. The kind that watches patterns instead of waiting for disaster. And the pattern remained unchanged. The bathroom lights still stayed on late. The water still ran beyond regulation. The guards still looked away. Consistency, more than kindness, made the difference. Is trust built through grand gestures, or through repetition without betrayal? The women stopped bracing themselves every night. That alone was transformative. Sleep came more easily. Tempers softened. Conversations grew less brittle. Even grief, when it surfaced, did so without panic. They were still prisoners. But they were no longer anticipating violation. That absence rewired something fundamental. Psychologically, the preservation of bodily autonomy, even in fragments, had consequences far beyond the physical. Studies conducted years later on former POWs would note this distinction repeatedly. Captivity that includes restraint produces different trauma than captivity defined by humiliation. Pain scars. Degradation corrodes. The camp's leadership may not have articulated it this way, but their actions reflected that understanding. Every system has limits. The question is whether those limits exist to protect authority, or humanity. What do you protect when no one is forcing you to protect it? From the guard's side, the burden of restraint was less visible but no less real. Power is not neutral. It presses on those who hold it, demanding release, justification, or expression. For some guards, restraint required daily effort. They were men shaped by a brutal theater of war, now asked to maintain composure in an environment stripped of adrenaline and purpose. The temptation to assert dominance existed, not always sexually but emotionally, psychologically. The urge to remind prisoners who was in control never fully disappeared. Yet it was resisted. Not heroically, not dramatically, but routinely. And routine in the end was stronger. Is discipline harder to maintain after the enemy stops fighting? The camp was never free of tension. Occasional arguments broke out. Rules were enforced. Punishments occurred. This was not a utopia and it was never meant to be. But the line remained intact. The bathroom was never searched unnecessarily. The lights were never shut off early by accident. The silence was never broken. No one congratulated themselves for this. That may be the most revealing detail of all. Historically, post-war narratives often seek clear moral binaries: good nations, bad nations, righteous victories, deserved suffering. But reality resists simplicity. Moral clarity, when it exists, is usually small and unannounced. This story is not about American goodness as an abstraction. It is about American restraint in a specific place, at a specific time, exercised by ordinary people who could have done otherwise. If morality only counts when it's noticed, is it morality at all? For the women, the camp became an unwanted but indelible reference point. Years later, when they would speak of their captivity, if they spoke of it at all, they struggled to categorize it. They could not describe it as kindness. But neither could they describe it as cruelty. What lingered most vividly was the refusal to humiliate. That refusal unsettled long-held beliefs more than any act of violence could have. They had been taught that surrender erased worth. Yet here they were, defeated, imprisoned, powerless, and still granted boundaries. That contradiction followed them home. It raised uncomfortable questions about the stories they had been told. About the nature of enemy and victor. About whether dignity truly belonged only to the strong. What happens when an enemy does not behave as expected? In time, news arrived that the camp would soon close. Repatriation discussions began. Paperwork multiplied. Medical checks intensified. The future, uncertain but undeniable, pressed closer. And with it came an ending to the unspoken arrangement. No announcement was made. One night, the lights went off on schedule. The water cooled. No one protested. No one asked why. The silence that had once protected dignity now allowed it to conclude without spectacle. The women understood. Mercy, offered quietly, must also be withdrawn quietly. Does respect lose its meaning once it becomes unnecessary? As they packed their few belongings, none of them spoke of the bathroom. They didn't thank the guards. They didn't seek explanations. Some things exist precisely because they are not discussed. On the final day, the buses arrived. Guards stood at attention. Orders were read. The process unfolded exactly as it should have. Officially, nothing remarkable had ever happened in this camp. And yet, something irreversible had taken place. A version of power had been demonstrated, one that did not need to consume vulnerability to confirm itself. That lesson lingered, long after the barbed wire receded into the distance. And it leaves us with a question that history rarely asks directly. If absolute power does not require cruelty to sustain itself, why do so many choose cruelty anyway? In the official records, the camp closed without incident. No riots. No scandals. No investigations. The paperwork described a routine process: transport schedules, repatriation lists, medical clearances. From the outside, it looked like any other administrative ending to a war that had already exhausted the world. But for the women who left that camp, the ending carried weight far beyond logistics. On their final night, the bathroom lights went out exactly on time. The water stopped running according to regulation. No one reacted. No one panicked. No one complained. They had known this moment would come. Does mercy lose its meaning once it is no longer needed? The silence that followed was different from the silence that had protected them before. This one felt complete. Close. Like the final line of a chapter no one would ever read aloud. The women packed their belongings carefully, not because there was much to take, but because order had become a form of control they could still claim. As dawn broke, they lined up. Names were checked. Instructions were given. Guards stood where they always had. Professional. Neutral. Reserved. There were no gestures of farewell. No apologies. No explanations. And somehow that felt appropriate. Respect, after all, does not ask to be acknowledged. Years later, some of these women would struggle to describe their captivity. Not because it had been mild, but because it resisted simple language. They had been defeated. They had been imprisoned. They had been powerless. And yet they had not been reduced. What lingered in memory was not kindness, but restraint. Not generosity, but boundaries that were never crossed. What stays with a person longer? Harm inflicted or harm deliberately withheld. In interviews conducted decades after the war, former POWs often spoke in careful terms. They described fairness, predictability, distance, the absence of humiliation. For historians, these details could seem unremarkable. But for those who lived them, they defined everything. They remembered the camp not as a place of compassion, but as a place where cruelty was resisted quietly and consistently when it would have been easy to allow it. This distinction matters, because history often celebrates what was done, not what was restrained. It records battles won, enemies crushed, power exercised. But moral authority is built elsewhere. It is built in moments when no applause is possible, when no recognition is expected, when the decision to look away is harder than the decision to act. Is victory still victory if it costs your humanity? The story of the Japanese Women POW Camp does not exist to glorify any nation. It exists to complicate the idea of power itself. It asks us to consider a different measure of strength, one that does not require domination to prove its existence. The lights that stayed on late were never meant to be remembered. And yet, they are the reason this story still matters. Because they prove something unsettling and enduring. That even in war, even in captivity, the line between cruelty and restraint is not drawn by circumstance, but by choice. If you were the guard, holding absolute power over another human being, what would you choose to ignore? Leave your answer in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel. Because history isn't only shaped by what happened, but by what could have happened and didn't.